Alright, everyone, this is going to be one of the first Metalhead manga reviews I've done in quite a while. So basically what we're getting at here is that we're doing, this is going to be part one of sort of a 3-series book where I'm reviewing 3 different books that I don't necessarily want. So one of them exactly is Viking Hondbok, which is Hondbok, which is just the Norwegian word for handbook. And basically what this is that the Viking handbook presents itself like a comprehensive guide to Viking daily life as written in great detail. And sometimes, let me just adjust the camera over there. It includes several examples of post-modernistic and modernistic ideas on Norse culture and acts as a way to teach people who only really have watched the Thor films or have read the comics, because it treats the reader like future to think like the past should be villainized instead of understood. And this is just something that I have written in the script beforehand, but truth be told, a lot of this is subject to interpretation as far as just the individual quality of the book is concerned. One sentence that pissed me off the most was the notion that now to pour some cold water on the idea of Berzerkers, which, going back and actually reading this book, it actually doesn't say that. That's something that I wrote when I initially wrote the script. But what's something I should actually note is that it actually kind of elevates the idea of Berzerkers into sort of a romanticized, almost fantastical nature. So if we were to look at the section that talks about Viking combat, actually, I'll just speaking for a minute, or it's just I actually do have a section. My apologies if I haven't explained anything in the past 2 minutes, but basically the other section, did the Vikings be like Berzerk in many historical accounts? This is reading from the text, by the way. And in much of pop culture, Vikings are synonymous with ferocious violence. The medieval sagas attribute the wildest and most bloodthirsty feats to warriors, sometimes called Berzerkers or Berzerks, which literally translates to bear shirts, although sometimes it's translated as bear shirts, as in someone wearing bear fur. Sometimes it's also depicted as someone wearing like no shirts or bear of shirts. Snorri Sturluson, one of those famous authors of the Icelandic sagas, described Berzerkers as Odin's mystical warriors in his 13th century poem, Inginger Saga. Odin would make his enemies in battle blind or deaf or terror-struck as their weapons, so blunt that they could do no more than a willow wand. On the other hand, his men rushed forward without armor, antlers, mad as dogs or wolves, and bit their shield, and were strong as bears or wild bulls, and killed people at a blow, but neither iron nor fire told upon themselves. These were called Berzerker. The Berzerkers may have been mythically by the makers of Lewis chessmen, perhaps the most famous chess set in history. Lewis chessmen, chess set in history, found at Horden in Outer Herbie, Scotland. The Berzerk in the set holds a classic Berzerk shield binding. Historian Anders Windroth points out that most of the sagas that compare Berzerkers, bloodthirsty wolves, dogs, bears, and bulls, written centuries after the end of the Viking Age. That is very true. A lot of our accounts are just very dodgy at that, so take a lot of this as whatever with a grain of salt, I guess. One contemporary Berzerkers appears in a poem dedicated to the king of Finnhad and the 9th century as the Battle of Huddersfield began. Berzerk's Berzerk bellowed Wolfskin's Hameld. As mentioned elsewhere in this book, scholarly poetry constrains entry angles, metaphors, and elaborate descriptions known as kennings. Kennings are an Old Norse specific way of referring to somebody as a riddle-like nickname. So, for example, if someone is known for really liking blueberries, it would be known as Jeff Blueberry Man, or simply the Blueberry Man. An example of this actually exists a lot of the time in modern pop culture. Like, for example, if any of you are familiar with Undertale, the character Gaster is known as the man who speaks in hands. That alone is a kenning. So, describing somebody with a moniker or a phrase like "man who speaks in hands" could be a kenning, or it could be similar to how some people give high school names to their friends and things like that. And then kennings for warriors included the Tree of the Sword, Feeder of Ospreys, Queller, the Greed of Wolves, and the Tree of the Mail Shirt. I don't know, I wonder what finds it more likely that the bear shirts and moleskins of the poem are descriptors of warriors in chainmail shirts. This is apt, I guess. Not even apt for a reason, just apt. Oops, apologies for the lighting. Many of the songs have been after the coming of Christianity, closely associated as Berzerkers with long ago pagan times. So show Berzerkers' powers disappearing once they accepted baptism. And then, obviously, this is a lot of just random. This is kind of where I get into the idea that a lot of this writing is just like Kjersti Edgerdahl's kind of appeal to sort of the modern ideas. In reality, a lot of these writings are just kind of Christian sagas kind of talking down on Berzerkers, and a lot of the time it's just people working off of what little we actually have recorded about people who are potentially historical Berzerkers. But a lot of this, this is kind of where we end a lot of the speculation, but we'll kind of just move on from that for now. Set that to the side, if you will. And then getting into right here. Yeah, and this is actually another part of my script that I was going to get to. So, Kjersti Edgerdahl's attempt to dull down the potential aspects of the actual bear, wolf, fox, or other animalistic groups. He actually mentions that the kind of animal that Berzerkers could adopt from in terms of gaining some form of power are wolves, dogs, bears, bulls, but there were also foxes, and just any kind of animal in nature. I guess you could just point to an animal and be like, I'm going to adopt a Berzerker style of that animal. I worship gods, creatures similar to what we now call the Norse Gods today, which these groups took place for more often in the 2nd century rather than the 9th century, where the Vikings were present. Because, fun fact, a lot of these idea of Berzerkers or Utfedin or Utfednar are more connected to basically ancient Germanic tribes, predating the kind of Norse peoples by centuries. Going back to, like I said, the 1st century, and we have this evidence of this because we have inscriptions of poems called Gadadal, Gadastetadal, and Krigsgaldar, which is like magic, law magic, and like war magic, roughly translated. These are poems or collections of poems that are written in Proto-Germanic and Proto-Norse, and that have just been translated since the beginning of time. And it's actually in eras like these that we see warrior like tribal groups showing up more often and operating in the way that we think of Berzerkers, if we were to imagine Berzerkers as how a lot of people just seem to imagine them, I guess. And then they also talk about random, and that Kjersti Edgerdahl often talks like a random college student that just picked up this topic for a presentation due to how they address Odin as allfather instead of Maestro, which is actually what his Old Norse title means, allfather. The reason why this is the case is because is carrying odd fóðir, which meant something similar to English words like teacher, master, instructor, not unlike the Japanese word sensei or the Spanish word maestro or maestra. They also call Thor the god of thunder, lightning, but the Norse gods are not gods of things. They are gods that have specific personalities, they have ideas, but a lot of those identities are heavily dependent on how they're interpreted, so whatever it is you can imagine Thor or Odin to be, it's really entirely up to you. Not meant to be shown as all-knowing or all-good, but as non-Euclidean force to be reckoned or reasoned with, because that's kind of a thing that's consistent with a lot of Norse stories, whether or not written by the later sagas of the late medieval period or by runestones that kind of inscribe in period sort of tales of how these gods would have been perceived. You just kind of get this mixed idea of like, okay, they do one thing in this story, but they do it differently in this story. So I'd imagine that a lot of them, because these are personified versions of things that just happened in the world around the Norse people of that time, if there's just interpretations based on like, I say something I can't explain, so here's my interpretation of it. Just kind of a fun way to, I guess, imagine how a lot of these stories might have been told. And with Uncountable Power and world is complex, if not more so than rocket science. That is also something that isn't happening a lot in Norse stories and in other interpretations of Germanic gods as well. It's about how Shiv and Berzerk is portrayed. So if you ever have read Berzerk and you see how she was portrayed in that manga, that's how I imagine the Norse gods to be interpreted, at least for me. Or like how Eldritch gods are portrayed in things like H.P. Lovecraft novels or other kind of cosmic horror, for those who are familiar with cosmic horror. Overall, I would not recommend this book to anybody. Going back to the original topic of, is the Viking Handbook, does this get the rule of Metalhead manga review? I don't really think so. Anyone who wants a comprehensive application of Norse culture, lifestyle, weaponry, dining, music, religion, friðþykar, and everything else, I would not recommend this. As even in the National Automotive Museum, there are better books on historical Viking anything, as that is where I bought this book. So there are, I find that Children of Ash and Elm, which I actually have in my collection over there somewhere. That was the same story, but with far more attention to detail and a greater sense of prose, as I expected from an esteemed professor such as Neil Price. This has been Metalhead Manga Review for Viking Hondbok. Overall, do not recommend. Go read Children of Ash and Elm. Signing off.